Okay. Boker Tov, Shavua Tov, and welcome to our last shiur this season. We would hope, Bezrat Hashem, to continue on Elul, but Rav Reines, I thought, would be a good place to stop before Tisha B'Av and before going into the summer break. Rav Reines, this shiur, as the rest of the series, is dedicated to Ilui Nishmat Rafael Moshe Ben Eliyahu. Now, one of you got, I think, my notes, which I would thank you to get back. It looks different than all the other pages now, so that's strange. Anyhow, okay, so valuable. Maybe they are. It's there. It's on the stack there. לא? טוב, אולי שכחתי את זה בבית. לא, בסדר, אני אסתדר. Okay, so Rav Reines was born in 1940, in 1840, of course. 1840 was a very special year. We spoke about it a few times because 1840 was seen and proclaimed by many as the year of the beginning of redemption. However, that's not what happened. And it was one more difficult year in the 19th century, which was not easy. Not that the 20th century would be any easier, but it was not easy. Rav Reines was born to a very special family. His father came from a family of students of the Gra, of the Vilna Gaon, and they made Aliyah to Eretz Israel and lived in Tzfat years before, in the beginning of the 19th century, years before Rav Reines was born. He made Aliyah with his wife, and he had a few children, and they lived in Tzfat. And then in the 30s, there was an uprising of the Arabs against Ibrahim Pacha, who was then the ruler of the land. And as part of their uprising against the ruler, they also burned down and destroyed the property of the Jews living in Tzfat, because that's what you do when you do an uprising. So the Jews were left devastated, and Rabbi Yitzchak Yaacov Reines' father was sent to Europe in order to collect money so the community would be able to re-begin. However, when he was away collecting money, there was a very strong earthquake that happened and completely destroyed the remnants of the Jewish community, and the wife and children of the father of Rav Reines that stayed in Tzfat were all killed. So he remained lonely. He decided not to return because there was no one to return to. Basically, the Tzfat community was destroyed. If you go to Tzfat to this day, they have in the museums there, they speak about this earthquake. It was a very shattering earthquake, and he decided to stay in Europe. He remained what we would call today a very dedicated Zionist. Obviously, that was much before what the political movement that was called Zionism was created, but he remained a great lover of Eretz Israel, but he decided to stay in Europe in a place called Karlin, which was a good-sized Jewish community. So he stayed there, and he remarried to a woman named Gala, and they had a son. And the son that was born in 1840 was called Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Reines. So you can imagine it's a very special to be born into such a family, because you carry on your shoulders a lot of responsibility. And I think he was born with this idea, which also this feeling of the love and the need to come to Eretz Israel, and B, this fear from some fate, fatal fate that may loom ahead. So these two ideas combined can be very strong, and Rav Reines, you may say, was born into them. Now, he was a young genius, as all of us. And from a very young age, he was known as a Talmudist, and he was a baki in everything, and he was very strong in the way of learning. They called back then the pilpul. Pilpul, without now going into fine details, is the ability to take ideas from very different places in the Talmud and ask from one place on the other and give an answer from a third place, and by that show how you can answer a fourth in a fourth place, which not necessarily was always very, we may say, exact or clear, but it was it requires a lot of understanding, a lot ability to hold very complicated buildings of this type of logic that was called the pilpul. So he was a genius in that way of learning, which was very creative, In a sense, you may say, and that's how Rav Kook put it down, the pilpul is the way of learning which is not scientific, but artistic. So a very artistic way of learning. It doesn't necessarily comply always to logic, but it is beautiful. If you can go and you can understand the whole thing, you can see it in its entirety, it's beautiful. And that's how he learned in his young years. From very young age, he was very much into writing. And we have descriptions of him from later years that he would like go into a trance of writing. He would have an idea and he would must write it. He would sit down and he would begin to write. And many times his pen would not be able to hold the pace of his mind. So he would skip letters, he would skip sometimes sentences, and everything would be written in very small font. And because he had this feeling that he must write down his ideas, and he would never have time to edit them because there would be new ideas coming in. And he was able to print he printed a lot, I think 10 books, but it was only a small percentage of what he wrote in manuscripts. His son had more than 100 notebooks of manuscripts from him. Unfortunately, many was lost in the First World War and some later in the other troubles that befell the Jewish people. But to this day, there are many manuscripts of Rabbi Reines sitting in the Jewish National Library in Jerusalem that are still waiting to be published. Nowadays, they are all scanned, and you can go online and read them if you are able to. I wouldn't advise it it's not for beginners. But for those of us who are more advanced in the reading abilities, maybe people that are used to read from doctors' prescriptions, so they are welcome to go online and type Rabbi Reines' name and try to read many of his manuscripts. I do hope that Be'ezrat Hashem, just a few years ago, in the Shemitah, a couple of years ago, before last Shemitah, Har Bracha Yeshiva printed one of his books about Heter Mechira that was never published before. So it's still more than 100 years after his death. It's still an ongoing project to print all of his handwritings. So here in source Aleph, you have his own description of himself. That he wrote in 1886, so when he was 46. And he says, Kol Yodai, it's in one of his books. It's interesting. I would say a few words about it. Sharei Ora is a book that was supposed to be it began as an introduction to another book of his called Shnei HaMeorot. But as he was writing the introduction, it got out of hand and it became a whole separate sefer by itself. And also, he didn't have the money to print the even bigger book that was the Shnei HaMeorot. So he wrote this Sharei Ora, as you can hear by the name, Sha'arei means the gates. So that is the introduction, the gateway to the big book. And he said, I would write that down, and hopefully by the money coming in from selling of this book, I would be able to print the next book. And he was able to. So the Shnei HaMeorot was printed. But you can see how the whole thing was going on. So in this introduction, and again, many times in his sefarim, he would go on tangentials and digress from the main point, and sometimes you would have a few lines on every page and a whole page of footnotes of thoughts he have and ideas. It's a very rich treasure, but not always easy to read. And also, I guess, for a lack of money, as you can see, the printing was not of the highest quality and not always very easy to read. And they do not reprint it because they are still stuck with printing the books that were not printed. So what we do have, that was printed for 100 years of the Ptira of Rav Reines, which was 7 years ago. And here they have like small quotations, short quotations arranged by topics. So you can find these writings by topics. That was printed by Hamizrahi Haolami, because as we would speak about, he founded the Mizrahi. But I used here the original publication for your delight. So in this introductory, so again, he's going on some tangential because someone wrote against one of his ideas. So he's writing about his own personality as a young man. All of that is part of an introduction to a completely different book. So you can see how things are going. And he says the following, source Aleph, Kol Yod'ayu Mekirai, everyone who knows me, know, Himimei Alumai Karati Britim Eti. So from a very young age, I have a covenant with my pen. Lichtov, Levaer, Lefaresh. So I'm writing, explaining, and commenting. בהיותי כבן ט"ז שנה, when I was 16, היה לי כבר יותר מ200 בוקין. So I had more than 200 pages of חידושי תורה. That is, booking is like a folio page. So more than 200 folio pages written. Again, as I know his manuscripts, we are speaking of a very small font written in very extensively. התחילו חידושים, ביאורים, חילוקים. So I had novels, I had commentary, I had chilukim means splitting of different ideas. ויש בהם ספרים מסודרים. And I already had, when I was 16 years old, I already had books that were already מסודרים, they were arranged from printing. שגם היום ראויים לצאת לאור. He says they are still waiting to be published. Some of them still are waiting. בשנה שאחרי העת ההיא, so after I was 16, נתקשרתי בקשרי התנאים, I was betrothed, וחותני הגאון הצדיק, זכר צדיק לברכה לחיי העולם הבא, כתב לי אז קונטרס קטן בעניין פה הנוכרית. He says, my father-in-law was a rabbi by himself, so he wrote to him a small booklet, a contrast, a booklet, small booklet about פה הנוכרית, about wheats. And כוונתו הייתה לכתוב על העניין מוזר, שלא יתרחב בו עוד הדיבור והפלפולים. So why did he choose to write to his young son-in-law about such a topic? So because he wanted to write to me something that not many people still wrote about. So back then, I guess, פה הנוכרית, a wig was for women, was not yet a topic that was redressed many times. And I guess the father-in-law wanted to impress, if I may say that, his young son-in-law, that he can write such a nice answer about a topic that is not well known. And כתבתי לו אז על זה תשובה בעניין זה, שהכילה יותר מ10 בוגים. So the son-in-law did not stay with his hands in his pockets, as they say. So he says, I wrote back more than 10 pages about the topic, and it was such an answer, such a response, והפליאה אין כל רואיה. Anyone who saw it was amazed that I was able to pull off such a writing. It's before the AI, right? Before and no Google. So everything was out of his own mind. So 10 pages, if you write things that are, coherent and make sense, that's impressive. I have to say, he had a very strong valuation of himself, which many times is part of being a genius and having the self-confidence, I would say, to put out your abilities and to exercise them and to realize them. So you must know the value of yourself. If you do not have this self-confidence, you'll not be able to exercise really the abilities given to you by Hashem. And sometimes even he feels that what he writes is like boasting. So he says, I know that I'm not writing in order to boast, but because the things are, he says, they are alive in me. And as I said earlier, he was writing, I don't want to say as a possessed, but I guess that would be the right word, right? So sometimes it was not really him writing. It was the idea writing through him. That's how we felt. So here, I return to the story. He says, ועודנה תחת ידי, I still have this response of 10 pages, ויכולה להתחשב מהתשובות היותר חשובות וראויות לראות אור. So he says, I believe that's one of the best answers that were ever given on the subject, it is deserved to be printed. And he says, some of that was printed by my father-in-law. והפרק ההוא אני הייתי כבן 17 שנה, so I was still 17 years old. And back then, as I said, he was still very much into pilpul, being into writing different topics and asking from one place to the other. ובעיר מולדתי בבית הכנסת שלמדתי אז, in the shul where I was learning, and he went to Volozhin and to another big yeshiva, Lithuanian big yeshiva called היישוב back then, but for less than a year, obviously he was a very independent soul. He couldn't learn, he was not part of the stamping project. So you couldn't put him into, how do you say, a cookie cutter? He was his own man, for sure. And I guess that he went, now Volozhin was a yeshiva that was allowing people to become who they were, but if you are extremely independent, then no frame can work for you. Right? So he had to be his own thing. And nowadays we have a problem with children of the sort. Because, you must go through the system. And sometimes it is very difficult for them. But back then, there was no חוק חינוך חובה, right? There was no formal education law. And if you wanted, you can just go to the shul near to your house and sit. There was no air conditioner. But you can sit down and learn. If there were sefarim and there was a stender, you can sit down and learn by yourself. And that's basically what he did. And how would you develop in your learning? So people would come into the shul from time to time, תלמידי חכמים that are going around, and you'd speak to them in learning, and you would get what you get. So as you can understand, it was a system. If you were a genius, it was perfect for you. If you had the self-discipline, it was perfect for you. If you were not, it was a disaster. But for him, it was excellent because he had the self-discipline. He could sit and learn, and he had from different people, and his mind was always flowing, right, with these new ideas. And then one day, he says, someone comes in, and it's a very interesting story. If it was 500 years ago, we would say it was Eliyahu Navi. So someone comes in, and he says the Chabura, before that, the Chabura finished the Shas, and so the people learning inside, they learned the Shas, and he said the Hadran, he said the Siyum for the whole Shas, and he says, I gave a drasha for 3 days in a row. So I don't think that it was really for 3 days in a row. I think he means that he had like a shiur of an hour and a half, and he gave the shiur in continuing for 3 days. So people were impressed by this 17 years old doing that. Maybe they also ran away, but people were impressed. He said, I still have the shiur, etc. Skip a little. He says, ובהיותי עוד כבן ט"ו שנה. It's in the middle, more or less, of the paragraph. בהיותי עוד כבן ט"ו שנה, it says, so when I was 15, can you see that? In the middle. Okay, so when I was 15, בא לעיר מולדתי בבית הכנסת שלמדתי. So back in Karlin, came one person to sit and to learn, לשבת ולהגות בתורת השם. והאיש ההוא היה חכם גדול בחוכמת החשבון הנשגב. So he was very wise, not only in Torah, but also in math. And you have to remember, we are in the 19th century, and science began to develop. So he was not only great in חשבון, meaning in calculation, but חשבון הנשגב. So I cannot say for sure what does he mean by חשבון, the higher math. So I'm not sure what does he mean, but it was very impressive. ודיבר על ליבי לקחת לקח ממנו שעה אחת ביום. This person was able to convince the young Rabbi Yitzchak Yaacov to sit and learn with him hour a day חשבון, algebra. So that's how things were. You see, there was nothing that was מסודר, no curriculum. People coming in and you learn with them. So here I would sit and learn חשבון, fine. והחל ללמוד איתי בספר כלי לחשבון. And he began to sit, and there was some sefer, some book in Hebrew that they were using for learning mathematica. And he says, והיה קשה לי, אשר למיעוט ידיעתי בלשון ההיגיון, היה קשה לי מאוד הלימוד בו. But I was not good in logic. Because he learned, as I said, more artistic. But Pilpul is very different from math, from algebra. In algebra, you need to be exact, not ideas from there and from here and inventing things. You need to be very, very exact. And Rabbi Reines find it difficult to learn mathematics. So he was given an advice, or advised by this person, והאיש ההוא הייתה עצתו אמונה, so his advice was, שאלמוד ספר מילות ההיגיון. So ספר מילות ההיגיון, Words of Logic, is a work by Rambam. It is accepted that Rambam is the author of it. And the Words of Logic. And it's basically, it's a thesaurus, it's a lexicon of logics. So by learning it, you learn the formal terms in Aristotelian logic, but you also learn the way of thinking. So how, for example, something that you would use a lot later in his life, how do you get to a conclusion? You do not just make a sugya and thinking aloud and extrapolating. What you do in order to surmise a logical conclusion, you need to have two premises, right? And that's called syllogism. That you learn from two known sentences a new conclusion. So, for example, that's the way that they love to put it in Greek. So, if you know that all humans are mortals, and you know that Plato is human, then you know that Plato is mortal. Right? That's a very easy example of syllogism. So, by that, you are able to conclude. So, you begin from known facts about the world, and you begin to learn more and more. But that is math, that is logic. That is not Pilpul. It's a very different way of thinking. And the young man was conquered by this new way of thought. זוכר אני עד היום, he says, I remember to this day, that's 30 years later, איך שהלימוד הזה עשה עליי אז רושם חזק. I was greatly impressed by learning this small book of מילות ההיגיון, the words of logic. והחילותי להתחקות על שורשי הלימוד הזה. I began to go to the roots of this teaching, learning, ולנסות להשתמש בו בהליכות לימוד הגמרא והפוסקים. So I thought suddenly I had an idea. Why not to learn גמרא logically? Not pilpuli, but logically. Taking one assumption, second assumption, and checking what is the conclusion. So not, again, people would many times not learn from the content, but from the give and take, from the shakla vetaria. Why do you ask this question? You could have asked that question. So from here we can surmise A and B. That is pilpul. But logic would say the following. Let's say that Tisha B'Av is a day of Avelut. So we need to check the laws of Avelut and the laws of Tisha B'Av. And we are supposed to find that they would be equal. If they are not equal, we have to ask ourselves, why are they not equal? According to that, understand the nature of either Avelut or of Tisha B'Av. I hope that I am able to, in this very short example, explain the way in which this new method of learning is very different than the people, because the people would say, open Gemara, see the text, and try to surmise from the text, and ask a question from here, and a question from there. And the way to answer the question will teach you new halachot. By that way of learning, you do not go to the roots of the concepts. You are only dealing with the give and take, with the dialogue, with the framework of the discussion, and not with the content of the discussion. So here we have a whole new idea. He was not the only one to have this new idea. I hope that we would speak Bezat Hashem either in Elul or in the winter we speak about Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, Reb Chaim of Brisk, which this new method of learning is more related and usually is being מתייחס. It's being מיוחס, it's being assigned. It's seen as his own chidush, his own novelty, but we can see here very clearly that Rav Reines, more or less at the same time, even a few years later, had the same idea that we need to approach the Talmud differently, not only. Obviously, you still learn the text and try to surmise from the textual hints in the Masa U'Matan Talmudi, in the Gemara's discussion. But nonetheless, he would begin to think from a different angle. Let's deal not only with the text, but also with the content of the text, with the halachot themselves, trying to go into the very inner meaning of God's laws. And that would be something that would be one of the greatest projects of his life. One of three, we may say. So one was try to reinvent the wheel, try to reinvent Gemara learning. And Gemara is being taught in this for 1,000 and I don't know, 300 years at the point in which he comes. But he says we need to rethink the whole thing. Now you can imagine that is not something that is going to go without objections, right? You have a new way of learning Gemara. Everyone before you was not so smart, and you are Moshe Rabbeinu coming down from Sinai with a new way of telling. But Rav Reines, that's another thing we would see, when he thinks that something is correct, he is going for it, and he is not going to give up. And he would write a whole book. What he wanted to do is, the project was to write encyclopedia, in which he would go through the different concepts of the Talmud by logic. So, for example, you would have the term lechatchila, and he would try to explain to you what the term lechatchila means. Or you would have the term siba, reason, and he would try to explain to you in what ways the term, in hundreds of halachot, but the concept is the same concept. So it's a very scientific method. It's almost, he's trying to understand the philosophy of halacha. So that's a very new thing. Many people would find it, as I said, objectionable, because it's not the traditional way of learning. And he would not be able to complete the project. He wrote many, many pages, as I said, but and he published some books in this direction, but he was not really able to accomplish that. The Encyclopedia Talmudit nowadays, it's not really the same thing, because they are not as philosophical as he is. They are taking concepts such as Yom Kippur, Tisha B'Av, Afeilut, and they explain the halachic concepts, but they do not go down into the philosophy behind it, as lechatchila, or this type of terms. Now, we have to understand the difficulties in the way that he suggested, because if you are writing an entry about Tisha B'Av, you can bring all the opinions about Tisha B'Av and all the different laws, and that's a very good halachic encyclopedic entry about Tisha B'Av. If you're trying to write about something which is very, very abstract, rabbinic authority, that will be very subjective. It would be very difficult to write something which would cover all the spectrum of opinions. Also, his writing style is difficult, as I think I hinted earlier. It's so interesting because he accepted upon himself the yoke of logic, but in his mind, he remained a pilpulist through and through. And he was very associative, jumping from one place to the other, always trying to remain very scientific and very logical. But he was just this type of a person that was very associative. So he would write on one thing and then the other thing, and everything would be very, very logical, but you cannot find anything. And that's just a type of a person. So you need a very strong editor. And that's something he never had. So the project was not really successful, but even just thinking about it and trying to accomplish that, that's in itself begins to show us the range of this person, of Yitzchak Yaakov Reines, and the length to which he was willing to go if he thought that something is correct. But it's only revolutionizing Torah learning is only the beginning. In the age of 24, he became a rabbi of a very small city. And then in the age of 26, he went to a big, I think we already spoke about the way that Rabbanim would advance in that world and in this world, to this day in some places, if they're not getting stuck in one community. So if they are good, they advance from a smaller community into a bigger community and so on. That's what he did. And when he came to a slightly bigger city called I apologize. I don't have my, I don't have my notes. It's a city in then Poland, meaning in then Russia. Schwunzin, something like that. Schweinzin, I think. So he became the rabbi there. And then he decided a new idea. He said, you see how important it is to merge the teaching of secular philosophy or secular logic with Torah learning. He says, I also see that Torah learning is being hit all through Eastern Europe. About Western Europe, I'm not speaking anymore, but about Eastern Europe, young students are dropping out of yeshivot because they want to learn the new sciences. So he says, time had come to open, we would not call it like that, but we would call it the first yeshiva tichonit, a high school yeshiva high school, a place in which they would learn Torah, but also they would learn secular studies in a very high level, because I believe, that is the way to stop the hemorrhaging, the blood, the hemorrhaging, the losing of so many young Jews. That's one, very important. And B, because I believe that as a positive value, not only in order to stop, but also because I believe the time had come that we would advance our Torah learning based on what the best of secular knowledge has to offer. Why not? Why should we be afraid of something? So that was a very bold move. And you can imagine that the Rabbanim back then that were fighting every reform, we remember, we spoke about Rabbi Yitzchak Spector, they were fighting the tendency to reform because they were afraid, and they had very good reasons to be afraid, that behind all of these attempts to reform the Jewish Hater system stood the reform, because that's really, these were the type of people that we were dealing with. And the Russian government that was trying to secularize in order to Russify the Jews. So they were against any small change. And here he is coming and not offering a small change. Let's stop hitting the children. So that was like a change that was debated. He says, let's reform the whole meaning of a yeshiva. And yeshiva from now on would not be only a place where you learn Torah, but would be a place in which you learn Torah and secular studies. That's like a nightmare for them, for the Rabbanim. Even they all knew that Rav Reines had the pure of motivations. Really the pure, no one debated his righteousness. But they said that what he's doing is just very, very dangerous because he's playing into the hands of the reform movement. And let's say that he would succeed. Let's say that he would succeed. So immediately the Russian government would decree that all yeshivot must become this type of yeshivot. And even if his yeshiva would be able to keep as shomer Torah or mitzvot, and the teachers coming to teach secular studies would only be people that would not affect the children. Everything. Let's imagine that you would succeed. Who gave you the permission to put into risk all the greater Russian Jewry? So they were vehemently opposed and very strongly opposed. But he didn't back down because I think you already understood the type. But not the Rabbanim, but other people that also got into the fight. So they, in order to stop him in his yeshiva, they went and they were malshinim. Right? So they were giving false information to the government that he's hiding money, that he's stealing money, that the yeshiva is not really going according to the law, which may have been. You couldn't go according to the law if you were a Jew in Russia. The law was built against you. We have to understand that. As a very, very side note, I would say that's part of our problem today. So many Jews get used for hundreds of centuries that the law is against them, so the only way to work is under the table, is circumventing the law, because the paritz is against you. And many of us, got here to the Jewish state, and we are still in the same state of mind, right? That the paritz is against you. The paritz is ourselves now, but it is what it is. So I wouldn't be, extremely surprised if something there was not completely 100% according to the law, but the laws were skewed. Okay, anyhow. So he was put into jail, custody not for a long period of time, but enough in order to completely destroy the yeshiva. So after 4 years that the yeshiva existed, they were able to close it down for him. He was devastated, and we have letters from him for later years in which he cries about what they have done to him, as you can understand. And he says that's the trouble of our people, that every time someone tries to do something good, there will be people that would oppose him and hate him and destroy him. And but again, I can also understand the other side. We have to admit that the other side, which had very great Rabbanim, not necessarily the means that they took, and not necessarily that every step that was done against him was agreed upon by the Rabbanim that were leading the opposition. But they had very good reasons why to oppose. As I said, even if you think that your yeshiva can work, what would be the effects to the greater community? In 1889, even earlier, we spoke about the Chovevei Tzion movement. That is the movement of the Zionists before the Zionist movement, before Herzl. So the Russian Jews were, especially after 1882, after the pogroms, after the death, the murder of the Tsar, then there were pogroms against the Jews, and everyone understood that it is really organized by the Russian government, and there is no future for Jews in Russia, and something has to be done. But the question always was, what has to be done? So one of the ideas was, let's go to Eretz Israel and create a Jewish state. It's very far into the future, but let's begin to move into Israel. And people would, Palestine, or back then it's just part of the Ottoman Empire. So people back then were gathering into like this small amutot, igudim, buckets, groups, and they would try to save money and to buy lands and to establish colonies, and that's how it worked. So from 1882, this Chovevei Tzion, that's what they were trying to achieve, and he was very much in favor of that. We remember that his father already made Aliyah almost 80 years before that. So he came from again, Zionist. I'm using this in a very anachronistic way, but a very Zionist family, loving of Zion family, and he was all in for Chovevei Tzion. But more than that, he saw that as an opportunity to reintroduce, as I said, healthier methods into the Jewish nation, because he saw the whole existence of Jews in Eastern Europe and in Galut in general as problematic, as sick in a way, not healthy. Because you are distancing yourself, as I said, from secular knowledge. You are distancing yourself from land. You are distancing yourself from productivity. And in order to repair that, in order to fix, to correct that, and in a Jewish way, you can go to America, but then you would not remain Jewish, meaning back then. So if you want to repair that, if you want people to come back into the real world, but remain Jewish to the core, the only place where that can be done, he thought, was in Eretz Israel. So he was very much in favor of the Chovevei Tzion, and even that it became clear from very early on that some elements in the Chovevei Tzion leadership were extremely secular, he, again, was not the man to be afraid from such a challenge. And I quoted here, it's in the second side of the page, that's a letter from 1889. And he says, he became, I forgot to say, that he became a rabbi in a big city named Lida. It's nowadays in Belarus. So he became the rabbi there, and he remained the rabbi there until his death in 1915, during the First World War. So he became the rabbi there, and let's read the letter. So it's from Yud Tammuz, okay, so it's more or less from our period of time, בין המצרים, תרמ"ט, that's 1898. כבוד ידידי ורב חביבי, היום בעתני הכרתו ושמחתו לשמו משלומו, משלום ביתו, שלום עד העולם. So I received your letter and I'm giving you שלום. רבות סבל הנפשי, עונג מדבריו היקרים ומולאים. I very much enjoyed what you wrote to me. אבל לדאבון הלב, but unfortunately, גם פה נתעמת הפתגם הידוע, כי בעולם הזה אין עונג נקי ולא שמחה צלולה, כל עונג מהול בצער וכל שמחה מעורבת בתוגה. So he says, but unfortunately, as we all know, there is no a clear happiness in this world. Every time you are happy, there is something said that would happen to you. And again, that's his it's personal history speaking from his mouth. So he says, I know that I can never be fully happy. Something bad must always happen. So with your letter, I was really happy to see your letter. However, מכתבו זה ששימח את לבבי והחיה את רוחי, this letter that really make me happy and revived my spirits, מכתבו זה, הוי, אין טוב ולא רע, there is no good without bad, הביא לי גם עצב ורוח כהה, also brought sadness with it, and bad spirit. כי בהגיעי לסוף המכתב, when I reached the end of your letter, וראיתי את בקשתו שביקש ממני, I saw the question that you asked me, להודיעו חוות דעתי על רעיון יישוב ארץ ישראל המפעם בקרב מחנה ישראל זה כמה שנים. So he says, I was asked by you to give you my opinion regarding settling ארץ ישראל, the idea that is awakening in our camp for a few years. יען בימים האלה בא לעירו מטיף אחד המעורר בדרשותיו לבחינו היקרים לתת ידם לרעיון הזה. So to your city, to the man he's addressing the letter to, came a Rav or someone, שליח, and was speaking about going to ארץ ישראל. And the very good at beat. And many people, רבים התעוררו לכל דבריו, וגם לב כבודו הלך לזה. Many people were impressed and were convinced. אפס מחאות המוחים המעוררים על זה ובאים בטענות ובפקפוקים. But however, there are many people that oppose this idea and they come with arguments and with פקפוקים, with doubts. ולדבריהם, according to the opposition, המחזיק ידי העוסקים ברעיון היישוב מחזיק ידי עוברי עבירה ונותן יד לפושעים. If you donate money to Chovevei Tzion, you really donate money to secular activities because they come to Eretz Israel, they establish here colonies, and in some of these colonies, they break the Shabbat, they desecrate the Shvi'it, they do not educate their children according to religious values. So how can you support such people? And he says, חס וחלילה. He says, חס וחלילה. מחאת המפקפקים האלה הגלויה עומדת נגדו. So he says, and so the man that sent him the question, the letter asking what is Rav Reines' opinion regarding this debate. And he says, again, I have to skip. He says, you see, there is זה שנים אחדות. I just went, there is like a break, and then the line begins by כן, זה שנים אחדות, I'm in the right column. אז זה שנים אחדות, הכילותי בעזרת השם לעסוק בעניין אחר מאוד נעלה. He says, you know what, a few years ago, I was engaged in some other very important activity, שחזיתי בו חזות הכל, which I thought is extremely important to the future of יהדות, העניין הנוגע בנפש האומה, עומד ברומו של עם היהדות. ומובן מאליו, as you can imagine, as is clear, לא עברו ימים מועטים, והמערערים הידועים יצאו ממחבואיהם, והשתדלו בכל מיני השתדלות להרסו ולקעקע ביצתו. He says the same thing happened to me. A few years ago, I was engaged in a very important thing. We can imagine that he speaks about his yeshiva, and immediately it says all these people that we all know came out of their holes. יצאו מחוריהם, so they came out of the holes, and they tried to destroy my innovation. וראיתי כי לשווא אחגור שארית כוחי, and I saw that is for vain, that I try to fight them, because all of their purpose is להרוס ולא לבנות, לעקור נטוע ולא לנטוע. So they only want to destroy. They didn't give me any advice how to build. Always they only say how I should cancel, and how I should seize, and how I should desist. So it says that the nature of the beast. No, he's moaning and bemoaning here, so we would skip all of these. It's appropriate for Tishat Yamim, but we would skip immediately to the left column. You see, to the first line. Now he's going to the content. So what are the arguments against חובבי ציון? ידוע כי בכלל טוענים מתנגדי היישוב שתי טענות ראשיות על העניין הזה. So there are two main arguments against חובבי ציון. א', כי רוב היושבים במושבות הם הקלי הדעת, so the people in the מושבות, in the colonies, are light-headed, meaning they do not observant, מבעטים במצוות השם ובתורתו, they kick חס וחלילה the Torah and the מצוות, and B, those that support in חוץ לארץ, הם מן החדשים והחופשיים, from the reforms and from the secular. So if you join the group, then you join this type of people. And he says, even if this argument was right, לא היה בה שום כוח לערער על עצם העניין. Even if it was right, these are the type of people that support it, it doesn't matter, because the idea is correct, regardless. That is, you said the difference, ad hominem, right? It's an attack against the person. It says, I am not dealing with the person, I am dealing with the idea. If the concept is correct, we should support it. If the concept is wrong, we should oppose it, regardless of who is the owner of the idea. That's very, you can see it again, I think, the influence of the scientific method. And he says, but a part of that, besides that, טענה בשקר יסוד, the whole thing is a lie. It is not right that these people are not observant, are not full. ידוע שיש במושבות הרבה אנשים יראים וחרדים לדבר השם, שאומרים ומקיימים את התורה כהלכתה. So you see פתח תקווה, you see other places, ראשון לציון. Many people that are very observant. Why would you'd slap them in such a way? ואם יש שם איזה אנשים קלי ידעת, if there are some people that are not observant enough, אין על זה להטיל דופי במושבות, ונהפוך הדבר, it's not bad, it is good. Why? לו הביטו המערערים בעיניים בהירות, בעיניים בלתי משוחדות, אז היו רואים עד כמה פעלה עליהם הארץ פעולתה הנמרצה, ועד כמה השיבתם לגבולי התורה והערה. He says you should see it in the right way. What is the right way? Let's imagine that these people would not go to Eretz Israel. where would they go? To the New World, right? To America. That's where everyone goes. Do you think there would be more Jewish there? Obviously not. They would assimilate. If they come to Eretz Israel, they remain Jewish. So that is not a place in which Yahadut is being destroyed, chas v'chalila. It's the best way to keep these people in the camp. If these people that are not right now observant, and to our big pain and sorrow, they are not keeping mitzvot. But what do you think? That they would be better off in one of the Western? They would not remain in Russia. They are not going to go to Volozhin. Right? That's not what is going to happen. Let's look at reality with open eyes. What is the best solution that we can offer to the thousands, dozens of thousands, maybe already hundreds of thousands of non-observant Jews? Do we have anything to give them apart of schooling them? Because schooling them didn't work. So what now? There is only one solution. And that is building on the national feeling that they have, which would send them to Eretz Israel. Right, it is not a religious feeling yet, and they are not observant as we would have wanted them to be. But you know what? They go to Eretz Israel, they do charity there with other Jews, they build the land. Isn't that a Jewish value? Aren't they, by being in Eretz Israel, by their mere existence there and working there and building the land and helping other Jews, are they not participating in the Torah in some sense? And much more than if they would have gone anywhere else. So how can you make maybe the strongest reason for the Jewish settlement in Eretz Israel, you make it into a reason against? That is the bulk of his argument. I think a strong one. So he says, again, this is a two-punch move. He says, one, even if you are right that people that are not observant, still, if the idea is correct that the Jews should go to Eretz Israel, that's what we should support. And B, it is just not, your whole way of thinking is not correct. Because that is not, chas v'chalila, a place in which people lose their faith. That is the place in which people maybe, Be'ezrat Hashem, regain their faith, because they stay in the fold. If they are going outside, they would never return. Okay, so that's basically his arguments. He is joining the Zionist movement formally in the 5th Congress, Zionist Congress, that is 1891 or 2. Again, I apologize, I don't have the notes here, but that's basically the order of events. And he is very excited about joining the Zionist movement, because here you have people that really work in order to establish a Jewish presence in Eretz Israel. However, he is very troubled, as you can imagine, by the secularism of the leadership of the movement. In the beginning, he is trying to completely separate, we may say, church from state. So he says, Zionist movement is about the attempt to get a political asylum in Eretz Israel for the Jews. That's it. We do not discuss the nature of the state that would be, or not the state, or the autonomy, or whatever it would be, that would be established. Let's do it when we have the state. Before that, we should focus only on pragmatic things. However, this suggestion was rejected, because the more progressive element, the leftist element, wanted, it was called the cultura, culture, the cultura. So they said we need to establish schools. I mean, we have Jews in Eretz Israel. We want schools that would educate for Zionism. And Zionism is not only the establishment of a Jewish body of politics. It's a whole idea, a secular idea. And Rav Reines was not able to convince them to abandon this idea of cultura. As a result, many Rabbanim had left Zionist movement. That was one of the reasons why things have rolled as they had. Many Rabbanim left the Zionist movement because they said we cannot participate in a movement that allocate resources in order to educate children to be secular. And so many Rabbanim and of course many simple Jews left the movement. Rav Reines remained. He established a fraction in the Zionist movement that was called the Mizrahi. That is Tafrei Samech Bet. That is 1902. 1902. He established the Mizrahi. And they came to a compromise. The compromise was that there would be two different streams of education. Zramim, the Mamlachti, it was not called Mamlachti back then, but the Zerem HaPoalim, and the Dati. And this, in many senses, this is the compromise to this day. To have Mamlachti and Mamlachti Dati, that is the compromise reached by Rav Reines, and with its strong advantages and with the problems that we all know that it carries with it. So that is the Mizrahi. And the Mizrahi became the father of what was later the Mafdal. And I think we all know the father and the mother of the Yeshivot Tichoniot, which were created in the idea of Rav Reines, which, by the way, many decades in the 90s of the 19th century, he was able to re-establish his yeshiva in Lida as a yeshiva tichonit, again, not tichonit, but as a high school yeshiva, or a yeshiva in which science are being taught, and that survived with 300 students. So it was a big yeshiva. It survived up to his death, and then the First World War destroyed it because the Germans went in and closed everything. It was not the Shoah yet, but they closed everything, and that was the end of that. When the communists took back the place, then, as you can imagine, no yeshivot were opened. So that was his yeshiva. So if we may conclude, Rav Reines really had three big projects. One was the attempt to revolutionize Jewish Torah learning. The second was to revolutionize Jewish education, not only Torah learning, but inserting secular teaching, scientific teachings into yeshivot. And the third was to return the Jews to their homeland, right? And if we speak in very bold strokes. And in his life, he was, as we can imagine, many times he was very frustrated by the opposition to these projects. By the way, also, we are out of time, but there is many things to speak about, but he was in favor of the Uganda program. Wow. Why? Because he said the Jews are under threat and we cannot toy with what we desire to do. As I said, he was a very realistic person. He said we have to take what we can. Now, this is very complicated. That's much beyond our scope now. But you can only imagine if there was a place in Uganda in the 40s, in the 30s, the Jews were able to emigrate to. How many Jews would be able to say? I mean, no one can answer these type of questions. But one can, can only wonder. No, he was buried in Lida because he died in the middle of the First World War. He was buried there in a very small levaya, and it took weeks before people outside of Lida even knew, because a few days after he died, the Germans went in and conquered Lida. And then the Russian came back, and then the communists took over. I mean, it was a whole balagan. I mean, First World War was very difficult for the Jews in Eastern Europe. It is unknown because Second World War had so bad that people forgot about the troubles of the First World War, but it was extremely bad in First World War. And so he was buried there, and his exact place of burial is unknown. Because it was destroyed in the wars that followed. So his remains were never buried here. But as I said, three big projects. He didn't see them realizing in his own life, but it is obvious that the institution he created and the organizations such as the Mizrahi had really were the beginnings and the origins of the path. And he was, as I said, extremely pragmatic person, a leadership type, someone that does not back down from opposition, and he was able, and someone that has a very far seeing, a very far ability to see very far into the future, and I think he's not known enough. He's not known enough as he should be. The Shchuna Neve Yaacov in Yerushalayim is named after him, and in many streets in around Israel there is a street named Rav Reines, but now we know who he is. Yeah, exactly. So I thought it's very appropriate to end before Tisha. By the way, he wrote a whole sefer about Tisha B'Av named Nod Shel Dma'ot, a jar of tears, and his life work was to reverse, we may say, Tisha B'Av, to reverse this destruction of the land, to reverse the tearing of the Jews from the sword and from real politics, from the reality, from living off the land. And his whole life projects, all of them, the whole three, were to reintroduce Jews into this world, and in that sense to redeem the Jewish people. And again, he was not zoche to see it being realized, but we nowadays can understand I think the hakarat hatov, right, the gratefulness that we have towards him and people like him that really advanced Jewish and Torah causes. So thank you, and we are going to vacation, and we re-meet Be'ezrat Hashem on Elul.
Thank you.